Welcome back to the Centre for Christian Spirituality for our Lectio, our reflection on the Gospel of the Sunday of the 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. I invite you now to listen to it as it is read. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honour, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honour, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honoured in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbours, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor and the crippled, the lame and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." I think we're all surprised how Jesus can draw a message from something that's just ordinary and everyday. He comes to this dinner, notices how the guests are seating themselves, and he has a message to give to them. And the message is that they need to be humble. I think it's summed up, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The first reading today is from Ecclesiastes, and it actually says that the greater you are, the more humbly you must behave. There's no cure for the proud man's malady. So really the message is that we need to be humble, and that therefore if we start humbly, the Lord will raise us up. I think we've all been into had experiences where you've been somewhere and sat down, perhaps not knowing what was to be done, and somebody had to come and ask you to move. It is embarrassing. And I think the point being made is, if you're embarrassed with that, imagine how embarrassed you're going to be at the resurrection of the virtuous, when you have sought with pride to do all the best things, and it's the humble that will be rewarded. But Jesus also has a message for the host. He's been talking to the guests there, and he talks to the host, and he says, when you invite people, don't pick out your friends, relatives, and people who are rich. No. In inviting them, you'll get an invitation back. I think very often people do invite people because they want an invitation back. But Jesus is saying that really invite the poor and the humble who cannot repay you, because then you will be repaid at a later stage. So again, it's Luke identifying with the poorer group, as it were. So I see the message as one of great humility there, and Ecclesiastes, I haven't actually focused on that text before, but it's really a wonderful text, and I think again, coming out of an everyday situation, Jesus is preaching a very profound message.
I think though this message of humility, David, is something that in my own life, being with people in leadership who are humbled,
Yes.
it is irresistible quality in people.
Yes.
That people actually want to follow those who are humble in the way they exercise their authority or power in a situation. And even in a lesser situation, people that it's all about their own ego. It's a very unpleasant situation. So I think it's really interesting, that part. And I couldn't help resonating with the who comes to the banquet or the table. working in Catholic education,
Yes.
I think that's been one of the great strength of the brothers and sisters who allowed those families, you know, the poor, the humble, the lame, to come to the banquet. And I just feel as though sometimes we have to remember that when we look at our Catholic schools, that they're not all about those who are, you know, Catholic and all able to, of means and capacity.
Yes.
And it's challenging.
It's
challenging in a modern
is.
time to make sure that we are who we say we are when we gather, even in our parishes too.
Yes.
I think perhaps that's one of the reasons for the attraction of so many towards Pope Francis. A word that he often uses of humility, being humble, and often in that context he's saying to we clergy the need to remember who we are, not to lord it over, but to be the servants. And the higher up the ladder, the greater is the call to service. The other thought that came to me in reflecting on that passage of Scripture is the fascination with the banquet table of the Lord. And I began to think two ways that I might be at that banquet table. I can be there as a guest, as you mentioned, David, and then all, you know, the richness that's there, that belongs to the guest who is being welcomed and treated loyally. And then the flip side of it, there are times at that table when I'm also the waiter, and I'm called to be that servant of others at table, and I think it's the embrace of both places at table, as guest or as host, or as a waiter rather, that I've just got to be able to find my place and who I am in different situations around that table.
Yes. We invite you now to look at the text before we read it again and just draw from it the important things that you consider to be important.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honour, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honour, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honoured in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbours, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. What's our response to the gospel we've shared today and reflected upon? What's its challenge for us as we strive to live our lives this week in the light of that gospel passage?
I remember many years ago I read that many of our priests and religious come from very humble families. But once they're ordained or professed, then so many doors open to them as religious or clergy that wouldn't have been open to them before. And to be ordained a bishop means there are even more doors open. So from being in a family that had very little to being somebody who was welcome at the highest levels of society. And I do think that's a temptation. And I think that we can easily be drawn into that. And it has the consequence of making us want to live personally at the level of which we've gone out and enjoyed, which is not the level of what our people live. I think that if you compare the lives of, well, I suppose we'd want to say the poorer of our people, I think we want to live more like them than perhaps those of our people who are quite rich. So I felt that what I would like to draw from that is just to reflect on who I relate to. And mind you, I think that the rich materially can be poor as well, so we certainly do need to relate to them. But I think the poor too have a role, and I think that in terms of the style of life we need to live, I think we can learn more from the poor than we can from the rich.
I sit comfortably with what you said, David, and it's been a reality in my own life of who you become and how that's perceived by the community of God's people. And yet the flip side of the coin for me is that growing understanding of and appreciation for the call to service. And I hear that in Pope Francis over and over again, and the smell of the sheep idea. So what's that saying to me here and now in the light of this for the coming week? It's not to presume that because I'm an ordained person that I have a right to A, B and C in my life, that I need to take stock of my expectations in the light of the position I have within the faith community.
Yes.
And I have a very simple one. I thought to myself, I usually at work have coffee with my friends at work and those people who I may be working with in a situation. I think maybe this week I need to have coffee with people who are very kind to me, but I don't invite them to coffee.
Yes.
So I think maybe that will be a good thing for me to do this week.
Yes.
We invite you now to reflect yourselves for a few moments in the light of the gospel. What is its challenge for you? How are you going to pick up its message and integrate that into your life in the coming week?
It isn't much good just knowing what we have to do or what we want to do. We have to do it. In a sense, reflecting on the Gospels is like looking in a mirror. We see the things in our life that need to be remedied. So we suggest now, you're having chosen something that you feel you need to do, turn to the Lord, ask the Lord for the strength, the courage, the prudence to do it as well as you can in your life.
Thank you for joining us this week. We hope that you've had an opportunity to reflect on the scripture and encourage you to join us again for next Sunday's reading. We ask you now to pray with us the prayer of the 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time from the liturgy of today. God of might, giver of every good gift, put into our hearts the love of your name, so that by deepening our own sense of reverence, you may nurture in us what is good, and by your watchful care keep safe what you have nurtured.